Have you ever heard of any non-Western country imposing sanctions on Western countries? Well, this has never happened, as putting sanctions is the weapon that the West has always used against countries that want to break free from Western monopoly. African countries are also not safe from those sanctions. Just recently, we saw the West putting sanctions on Ugandan, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic, removing them from the US-led African Growth and Opportunity Act. It was because these African countries decided to do what they saw fit instead of following Western orders. But as expected, the West imposed sanctions to punish them. That's when one wonders, why don't African countries impose sanctions on Western countries? On the Western side, there are 52 countries, including the US, Canada, and Europe, while Africa has 54 countries. What would it look like if all African nations imposed one of the stringent sanctions on the West? Let's know how precise the time is for Africa-imposed sanctions in this video. In June of this year, the United States implemented visa restrictions on Ugandan officials, applying sanctions in response to Uganda's adoption of an anti-LGBTQ law. Concurrently, the European Union enforced travel restrictions on the military junta responsible for the coup in Niger. The recurring deployment of such punitive measures by Western powers, particularly the United States and European countries, to exert influence on African nations has become a consistent pattern. And the West has developed this as a habit. If it does not like the policy of a country located in any part of the world, the West will unite and impose sanctions. That targeted country will be given two options: reverse what it did or face sanctions. You see, sanctions are more of a blackmailing tool than a legal measure in the international world. However, since the Western countries engage in it, the international community does not object. Despite accusations of human rights violations against Western nations in Africa and globally, there has yet to be an instance where an African country or organization reciprocated by imposing sanctions on a Western nation. Some argue that African countries might be perceived as too weak to take such actions. However, an alternative perspective suggests it might be time for African nations to reconsider this restraint, as the potential impact of African nations imposing sanctions on the West could have significant consequences for Western powers. History has shown that the African nations never united against any Western country to make the sanctions more effective, and that's a problem. However, what has happened now is urging Western countries to think about coming closer and imposing sanctions on the West for the first time in history. Sanctions serve as penalties imposed by powerful countries on smaller ones when they believe the smaller country is violating international law. However, there is no such violation of international law. Instead, sanctions are put in place because some countries often decide not to follow Western orders, despite being weak and small. Therefore, sanctions are imposed to punish them and reverse their decisions. This assertive move is often employed by powerful nations, particularly those with nuclear capabilities, to influence smaller nations to align with their preferences. While theoretically, any country can use sanctions, it is typically the larger and more powerful nations that employ this strategy more frequently. The 5 prominent members of the United Nations Security Council, which includes China, France, Great Britain, Russia, and the USA, possess special powers known as veto power, and they often use sanctions to advance their own interests. Unfortunately, this approach doesn't always consider the desires of smaller and less powerful nations, and the veto power wielded by these 5 countries can impede global peace. The United Nations Security Council is frequently criticized for its undemocratic nature due to the existence of veto power, and this, coupled with the use of sanctions, makes it challenging for regions like Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, and the Caribbean islands to achieve lasting peace. Among these places, Africa bears the brunt of sanctions, whether imposed by individual countries like the US or France, or international groups like the UN Security Council or the European Union. The commonly cited justification for the rationale behind these sanctions is peace and security. However, it prompts the question of how freezing a country's funds or suspending trade deals, actions that adversely impact the nation's economy and the lives of its citizens, genuinely contributes to achieving peace and security. This approach seems counterintuitive, as the measures taken have widespread consequences on the entire population rather than addressing the root issues that prompted the imposition of sanctions. Consider the case of Eritrea in 2009, when the United Nations Security Council alleged Eritrea's support for terrorist groups in Somalia and involvement in a dispute with Djibouti. Sanctions, including the cessation of weapons sales to Eritrea and the cutoff of aid and military training, were imposed on the country. Eritrea endured these severe sanctions for years, only for it to later emerge that there was no evidence supporting the claim of Eritrea's association with terrorist groups. In 2011, the UN Security Council added more sanctions, this time involving financial measures, such as withholding 2% of the taxes that Eritreans living abroad sent back home and altering the exploration methods in the mining sector. Facing these sanctions, Eritreans worldwide campaigned for their removal, reaching out through letters, emails, and appeals to all 15 members of the Security Council. Despite their efforts, only a few members responded positively. After a decade of grappling with sanctions based on unproven claims, the UN Security Council finally lifted them in 2018. Yes, Eritrea endured 10 years of sanctions for something it didn't even do. That's how punishment is given in international law. Even if those sanctions were lifted, the 10 years was enough of a period to bring Eritrea's economy to tatters, and that's precisely what the West wanted. Why don't we hear the same being done to the United States or France? Why are sanctions not put on them by mistake for a decade? Well, that's because they are the ones who use sanctions as a tool to blackmail. The problem is, at present, the West uses African organizations to put sanctions on African nations going against the West. Organizations like ECOWAS become a Western tool, possibly allowing external powers to interfere in the continent's affairs. This interference has led to sanctions and even military interventions, exemplified in the case of Libya during Muammar Gaddafi's era. At present, in response to the surge in coups since 2019, the African Union and regional economic blocs have implemented sanctions against offending states, primarily through the suspension of their memberships. From June 2019 to August 2023, the AU suspended the memberships of Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and, most recently, Gabon. Similar measures were taken by regional blocs in West and Central Africa against Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Gabon. In 67% of recent coups, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, imposed economic sanctions against offending states. That's the biggest proof that, in most cases, the Western nations punish African countries by using African organizations as a tool. But the good news is, in the current third wave of coups, a notable pattern is that sanctions did not prevent repeated overthrows in Sudan, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Sanctions imposed on Sudan, Mali, and Burkina Faso proved ineffective in preventing recurring coups in these states. However, as of now, we are seeing African organizations resisting pressure from Western countries. While Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Gabon faced prompt suspension, the AU hesitated to act against Niger. In Chad, the AU acted independently, refraining from treating the situation as an unconstitutional change of government and citing security risks. As of now, ECOWAS has become the West's favorite lapdog. It has issued economic and administrative sanctions against all coup countries in its region. However, their effectiveness was diminished by neighboring countries' actions. In Mali, some states expressed reservations about the sanctions and enhanced cooperation with the country's de facto authorities. Critics contend that African organizations may unintentionally facilitate external interference by imposing sanctions and permitting military interventions, prompting doubts about their effectiveness in safeguarding the continent's interests. The narrative advocates a re-evaluation of the role of African organizations, underscoring the necessity to assess their effectiveness in advancing peace and stability. The actions of the African Union and regional blocs like ECOWAS contribute to the susceptibility of African nations to external interference. If these organizations effectively fulfilled their roles, the European Union and European countries would not have grounds to interfere in African affairs whenever they please. It's astonishing that, despite the negative consequences of Western interference, the African Union and ECOWAS still seek approval and aid from the West during crises in Africa. The devastating impacts of such interventions are visible in the case of Libya. These observations hint that the African Union and ECOWAS might be acting as tools serving Western interests, deploying sanctions as a weapon instead of direct military action against nations that stand their ground. African leaders with Western support often evade sanctions, even amid allegations of corruption and suffering. However, when leaders resist certain agendas, they face sanctions on various grounds. Overall, there's a call for Africa to reassess its relationship with the West and assert its independence. The legitimacy of African organizations is scrutinized if they persist in serving as tools and playthings for Western interests. There is a need for Africa to stand resolute against external pressures and adopt a more self-determined approach to governance and development. Having endured Western interference for an extended period, Africa is now urged to reverse this dynamic. The proposed strategy includes actions such as sanctioning former colonial powers for their past actions, reciprocating sanctions on countries imposing unjust sanctions on Africa, holding those responsible for assassinations of African leaders accountable through sanctions, and imposing sanctions on nations contributing to destabilization in African countries. The exploitation of African minerals by the West should also be met with sanctions. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The suggested measures surpass economic actions, advocating a complete shift in diplomatic relations. Africa is encouraged to explore alternative partnerships with countries like Russia, China, and other Asian nations, diminishing its dependence on the West. Proposals include reciprocating travel bans and expelling companies involved in exploiting African resources and environmental pollution. The overarching goal is for Africa to become more self-reliant and independent, reducing its dependence on the West. The vision is to achieve an industrialized Africa free from external exploitation and interference. This transformation necessitates a courageous reassessment of Africa's relationship with the West, emphasizing self-determination and resilience. There is also a call for the dismantling of Western military bases, especially those utilized by the US and France for surveillance in Africa, aiming to alter the continent's security dynamics. But the truth is, sanctions imposed by the West on Africa did some unexpected good. The West thought it would always sanction Africa and still have it under its influence. But things have changed now. The looming threat of new U.S. sanctions against African nations appears to divert them from America's influence and push them towards a new world order orchestrated by the East. When historians analyze the conflict between the West and Russia, a crucial aspect will likely be the misguided beliefs held by leaders such as Joe Biden. They remain steadfast in their conviction that the Ukrainian army, with their support, could swiftly overcome the Russians, underestimating the situation's complexities. Additionally, these Western leaders overestimated the influence they believed their former colonial outposts in Africa held, expecting compliance with London and Washington's sanctions and perceived hegemony. Historians might characterize these misguided beliefs as delusional. This delusional thinking not only thrusts Western countries into economic challenges like the post-war years, including food rationing and soaring prices in the UK, but it also paves the way for a new world order and a transformative reset. This transformation starts with sanctions. While historical evidence suggests that sanctions often fall short of achieving their objectives, the effectiveness of more potent secondary sanctions remains uncertain. These sanctions target allies, restricting their trade with a shared adversary. Recent warnings from the Biden administration directed at African nations thinking the purchase of oil from Russia might have escaped the notice of mainstream media. Nonetheless, if implemented, these threats could represent a monumental historical error, potentially signaling the end of U.S. hegemony as currently understood. Recently facilitated by Turkey, Russia permitted grain ships to depart from the port of Odessa, mitigating a crisis faced by numerous African and Middle Eastern countries teetering on the edge of a food shortage. The implications of a nation in these regions being unable to produce and sell subsidized bread cannot be underestimated. Such conditions have historically led to revolutions, increased support for terror groups, and a surge in individuals fleeing to join migrant caravans heading for Europe. To his credit, Putin promptly endorsed the deal, responding to lobbying efforts from various countries urging him to act. Superpowers, as demonstrated, consider the broader picture. Europe, in particular, owes gratitude to Putin and President Erdogan for preventing a potential food crisis resulting from wheat shortages in the region. However, there is no sense of gratitude or goodwill, which could have laid the foundation for advancing these talks to the next level. Furthermore, we witnessed Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, delivering a rather clear threat to any African countries thinking about the purchase of Russian oil while she was in Accra, Ghana. It appears that America and the West collectively have overplayed its hand. The real repercussions will be felt by the West. Once again, Biden's miscalculation, a recurring theme like a stuck record, will result in blowback on the West itself. African countries might find ways to dissolve these sanctions. It is rarely reported that the secondary sanctions imposed against China, India, and a few others by the Trump administration to prevent them from buying Iranian oil were not upheld by Biden. Enforcing them might prove challenging. Precious metals and minerals crucial for Western-manufactured devices, such as iPhones, may face blockades by African governments willing to stand up to Washington's delusional, if not outdated, bullying. Cobalt, used in the production of lithium-ion batteries, might also find itself at the center of a sanctions clash. If the countries extracting it face sanctions, their governments may sell only to the East and be well rewarded for such a geopolitical move. The more significant threat from Biden's latest misstep, however, lies in the longer term. 20 African countries at a crucial UN vote in February refused to condemn Russia's incursion into Ukraine, and these leaders plan to stay non-aligned in a new Cold War unfolding due to the West's misguided policies demonizing Putin. These countries wish to stay out of a conflict they believe is not theirs and maintain trading options open to both camps in the future as China, Russia, and India forge stronger trade and geo-military ties, and the East starts to dominate. These new U.S. sanctions threats could prompt some of these countries to step out of their non-aligned comfort zone and align themselves with the new world order being shaped by the East. China is already the biggest investor in Africa, so this would not be a substantial leap of faith. In recent days, we have witnessed French troops withdrawing from Mali to be replaced by Russian mercenaries and new aircraft donated by Putin. New members in the Middle East can already see the writing on the wall and are applying to join BRICS. As of now, President Joe Biden has announced plans to exclude Uganda, Gabon, Niger, and the Central African Republic from the special U.S.-Africa trade program. These nations, accused of gross violations of human rights or a lack of progress toward democratic governance, will be removed from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, established in 2000. You should know that this act provides duty-free access to the U.S. for over 1,800 products for eligible sub-Saharan African countries. President Biden clarified that Niger and Gabon, currently under military rule due to coups this year, are ineligible for AGOA because of insufficient progress in establishing political pluralism and the rule of law. The decision follows the U.S. government's consideration in May to remove Uganda from AGOA after passing a controversial anti-homosexuality law that imposes a death penalty for certain same-sex acts. President Biden's decision may escalate tensions, prompting African nations to explore ways to neutralize these sanctions. The implications of this move, combined with potential conflicts over oil purchases, underscore the risk of a significant miscalculation with consequences for both the U.S. and the affected nations. The broader repercussions extend to the geopolitical landscape, with the possibility of alliances shifting as African countries consider aligning with the new world order shaped by the East. China's substantial investments in Africa make such a transition plausible, while recent events, such as the withdrawal of French troops from Mali to be replaced by Russian mercenaries, underscore evolving dynamics in the region. Furthermore, President Biden's decision could influence the long-term alignment of African nations in a new Cold War scenario, where non-aligned countries resist taking sides and prefer keeping trading options open. This move may inadvertently contribute to the East's growing influence as China, Russia, and India strengthen their trade and geo-military ties. That's precisely the time African nations should unite and impose sanctions on the West in return. The Western countries, particularly former colonial powers, have historically exerted disproportionate influence over African nations, highlighting instances where sanctions are viewed as punitive measures affecting African economies and political stability. By imposing reciprocal sanctions, African nations can level power dynamics, assert independence, and challenge unjust treatment by Western nations. The threat of reciprocal sanctions is a deterrent to discourage Western countries from imposing unfair sanctions, aiming to facilitate negotiation, dialogue, and a more equitable resolution of disputes. Advocates emphasize the call for African unity in imposing sanctions, fostering solidarity among nations to bolster Africa's global bargaining power. They contend that this united front would enable the continent to assert its interests more effectively. Advocates argue that imposing sanctions on Western countries would draw attention to perceived double standards in global politics, challenging the narrative that only powerful nations have the right to use sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Then, there is a power comparison of 54 African nations collectively imposing sanctions on 50 European states, the US, and Canada in response to sanctions against African nations. Before implementing reciprocal sanctions, African nations would need to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the potential economic impact on both sides, understanding the consequences for their own economies and the targeted Western nations. Gaining support from regions and countries outside Africa would be crucial, and alliances with nations sharing similar concerns about perceived unfair sanctions and global power imbalances would likely be sought. Since China and Russia are on Africa's side, imposing sanctions on the West can bring far more effective results. African nations would need to enhance their economic resilience to withstand potential repercussions from targeted Western sanctions, developing robust economic strategies and diversifying trade partners. And this has already been done after aligning with China and Russia. In the context of economic responses, African nations possess a range of tools to wield against the West. One such strategy is trade retaliation, which involves the targeted restriction of trade by focusing on specific sectors or goods crucial to Western industries. This could include measures such as limiting the export of cobalt, which is essential for Western battery production, or curbing diamond sales that drive luxury markets. The effectiveness of this tactic is heightened when African nations have control over strategic resources. Another avenue is the financial squeeze, which includes actions like freezing diplomatic assets or withdrawing funds from Western banks to induce financial turbulence and convey a potent message. Travel restrictions represent an additional tool whereby limiting visas or imposing travel bans on Western officials and business leaders can disrupt diplomatic channels and reverberate through interconnected economies. In addition to economic strategies, African nations can explore alternative approaches, utilizing the collective voice. Leveraging platforms like the African Union to condemn Western sanctions collectively has the potential to garner global support and exert diplomatic pressure. This may involve impactful addresses, highlighting the adverse effects of sanctions on African development and advocating for fairer trade practices. Do you think African countries should unite and put the harshest sanctions on the West as punishment? What will happen if the whole of Africa decides to take a stand, alienate the West, and tie with China and Russia? Let us know your thoughts on whether African nations have the power to punish the West and whether they are united. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.